Hello. Well, welcome all to this edition of the Transylvania Lectures. My name is Sükös Máté. I am an MCC alumni. I possess a degree in history and I'm currently unemployed. Yes. Well, so welcome all. This event, the Transylvania Lectures, is a series that aims to create a platform for the local public where we can invite renowned academics from all around the world with whom we can discuss relevant topics, not just for the Transylvanian community, but for a wider intellectual sphere too. So all welcome. The honor has been bestowed upon me to present today's esteemed guest. Herzlich willkommen in Siebenbürgen, Herr Jan Bentz. So please welcome today's speaker, Dr. Jan Bentz, Lecturer of Philosophy at Blackfriars Studium. It's a training center for Catholic priests, but also for laymen in Oxford. And he was a teacher of philosophy and history of philosophy in many Catholic institutions around the world, mainly in the United States and in the city of Rome, the Vatican. Today's lecture will be about the exploration of utopian thinking and how can one identify it. So without further ado, the floor is yours, Professor.
Thank you so much, Mate, for the introduction. Thank you, the MCC, for hosting me. Welcome to all of the guests. So I see a couple of my students here, which is nice. So welcome to all of you specifically, but also to all of the other guests that have come today. I was asked if I have slides, and unfortunately I'm a philosopher, so I just have to talk, make it more complicated for you. Hopefully not too boring, but I want to get your mind going, not just your eyes. So maybe just a little bit about this topic and why I'm researching it. I got really interested in Thomas Molnar, who is a Hungarian philosopher, who was translated, he wrote mostly in English, but he was also translated into German and French, and I think also Italian, actually. And he has been quite forgotten, not in the English-speaking world so much, but I think in Germany and in other countries. And so I wanted to, for his 100th anniversary of his birth in 2021, he was born in 1921, I edited a book on him, getting scholars together from all over Europe to write, on his impact on his thought. And so I wrote the chapter on Utopia, which was a topic that he spent a significant amount of time with. So that's kind of my relation to Molnar and also to the topic of Utopia. So what I want to do today is I want to explain to you a little bit what Molnar and others think Utopia is. So I want to give you an overview of kind of a definition of Utopia. I'm going to explain how Utopia can be seen as a secularized Christian worldview, basically, and I'll give you some concrete examples as well. And then at the end, so we'll have a discussion, but at the end, you're also all welcome to ask questions of clarification or questions, of further topics that are related or not related. You can pick my brain, as they say in English. Good. So the critique of Utopia is really central to Molnar's thought. And so in his book, Utopia, the Perennial Heresy, he basically gives an outline of what utopian thinking is and then gives examples of authors throughout the history of philosophy, mostly from the 17th century onwards, of this utopian thinking. So historically, and I think this is what's most important, Molnar locates the beginning of utopian thought in the late Middle Ages and as the first fruits of the Renaissance. Why? Because he says, in the Renaissance, for the first time in the West, men did not look back to the past for a golden age, but looked to the future for the golden age yet to come. So he sees the utopian mindset really blossoming with Joachim of Fiore and the millionarism that he starts. Millionarism, this idea that the end of the world is close, right, is coming. So he defines utopia as heresy, which is interesting. I can say something about this maybe in the discussion. But basically he says, well, what heresy is to the faith, to the Christian faith, utopia is to politics. So I can elaborate on that a little bit. Now, as an ideology, utopia serves specifically for political propaganda. And I think and rhetoric, when you understand that, so when you understand what utopian thinking is, I think you can read many examples of that just by opening the newspaper or, I don't know, listening, watching TV or listening to political speeches or podcasts and all of those things. So what are the roots of utopian thinking? Molnar specifically calls utopian thinking a permanent pattern of thought. And he says it's in contrast with a realist thinking about the world and about politics. So what's the difference? The realist affirms or tries to affirm reality as real and as knowable and as an object of investigation, mostly of philosophical investigation. And the utopian thinks of the world mostly in terms of what is still to come. And so he has to interpret the whole universe in the process of becoming. So in the process of, let's say, an evolution. And so the utopian sees the whole universe, the whole world, but also the whole universe as a single substance called monism that develops over time and space. What is central to so that's the philosophical root. What's central to this monist way of thinking is that there is an end point, there's a spiritual end point, the end of history, right? Which is the motivation and goal of all human activity, be it individual or political. So the spiritualized whole stands at the end of the historical development, and the utopian tries to implement changes now, in the now, in order to foster and to facilitate the dawn of this kind of end of history. Okay. The roots of utopian thinking, philosophically speaking, but also theologically speaking, go deeper though, because they reinterpret human nature in a certain way. So the utopian does not look at human nature as it is, but looks at human nature at what it could be, and thereby tries to redefine human nature. And I'll give you some examples of that towards the end of the talk. So, utopia is a philosophical movement, but also a political movement, and is really part of political rhetoric. And it is very interesting to see the religious elements of this utopian thinking, because the religious elements come into play when you look at Christian mysteries or Christian truths of revelation that are reinterpreted by the utopian to be used politically. Okay, so what are some of these features? The utopian form of thought has specific characteristics, and I'm not going to name all of them, but a couple. Number one, because the thinker sees pain and suffering and evil, he says, well, the world right now as it is not good or not good enough and needs to be better. Then the utopian has a love of reform, so of progression. They strive to true autonomy in kind of like the rationalist sense, like what Kant writes about this autonomy from authority. And the utopian as well has a pessimistic attitude towards the individual and an optimistic attitude to societal change, so to the group and what can be done with the group politically. Okay, at the basis of all of that, and again, this is the more philosophical element, is that there is a certain negation or very deep-seated criticism of being, right? Of being man. And the utopian looks at man and he rejects the current state of man. So he's not really interested as the things as they are, but he's more interested in the things as they ought to be or should be or will be or can be. And that's where you kind of compare the utopian to a realist. If you want to call a realist a more conservative thinker, conserving what is good, the utopian is more a progressive thinker, saying, well, there is not really much good to preserve, but the good is yet about to come. So we are now in a bad situation and we have to go and look forward to the good in the future. Okay, so in that sense, the utopian says, well, the order of being must be changed, and it must be changed specifically in a historical process. What is interesting about many utopian thinkers, and this is something that Molnar points out pretty well, but I think others have seen as well, is that the transformation of society is actually not done by the masses, so it's not very democratic, right? But is done by those who have understood that end of history. So it's done by those who are the enlightened ones, or the ones that are initiated, the ones that are in possession of knowledge, of true knowledge of, well, what the goal of history is. Because if you don't know what the goal of history is, you don't know what to do to reach it, obviously. Okay, so what I find is very interesting in the utopian mindset is that it is not just a political tool of rhetoric, but is really a philosophical interpretation of the world. Because when you talk about the end of history, you cannot only look at it as a historian, for example, but you have to look at it from a philosophical point of view. You have to look at, well, which cause will have which effect. And if you're interested in the effect, well, you think about what cause is connected. So what action will result in what effect, then politically or individually or as a society. Okay. And here I think it's very interesting to see that as a philosophy, the utopian borrows elements from theology. Because the end of history is not just something that is immanent to history, but that's something that is transcendent to it. And I mean, if you look at the ancient Greeks, for example, they saw history basically as cyclical. So there's a certain movement of history that always repeats itself because, well, things never change. So, right, there's nothing new under the sun kind of idea. So whatever happens will happen again. So every government will become corrupt, then there will be a revolution, and then there will be some kind of reform, and then the new government will stay in power for a little bit, and that will become corrupt, there will be a revolution, and so forth. So there's a cyclicity to history, to the understanding of history. Okay, so what are some of these theological kind of points that the utopian borrows, so to speak? And so I'm going to mention 3. I think there could be more, but we stick with 3. I like 3, so let's do 3. And I also don't want to bore you. Imagine if I'd say, like, okay, so there are like 18 points. Oh my God. Okay, so let's do 3. Number 1, the utopian borrows from the idea of the parousia. That's a complicated word. So let's compare it maybe with a Christian view of history, right? So the essence of Christian hope is also an expectation of the future. So Christians expect something from the future. Not just Christians, I think many other religions do that as well. And so Christianity defines man, and I'm sure that you've heard this, as the homo viator. So a state of being on the way. Maybe you've heard the word like pilgrim, right? The man is a pilgrim on earth. But a pilgrim has a goal. Like a pilgrim is not a tourist. A pilgrim is somebody that goes somewhere for a certain kind of endpoint, for a point of veneration. Whereas a tourist returns to where he came from. So, also for Christians then, there is this kind of idea of being unfulfilled. There is a not yet, right? So there is an unfulfilled possibility that lies in the future and that the future will bring. But how does that happen? So how does the homo viator, how does the pilgrim reach its goal, which hopefully is heaven, right? So it's eternal life. How does he reach that? He reaches that not out of its own power, but by grace. And grace is something given. It's not something taken. You cannot earn grace. You don't earn grace like you earn money for a job. You have nobody owes you grace, right? Grace is something that is given from above, from God. So when the Christian talks about this hope, this parousia, and the second coming of Christ, what that means is it's an event that he cannot control. He is the pilgrim on earth, and he's doing his thing, and he's praying every day, and he's going to church, and he's doing his work, and he's being charitable, and he's giving alms, and he's being a good person, hopefully. And at some point, the time will come, right? That's from Scripture, right? Nobody knows the time when the Son of Man will return. Okay. What does the utopian do? The utopian also says, well, the hope is in the future. Something perfect will happen in the future. And we are all on the way to that goal. So in that sense, it's similar. But the end point is something that we make. It's something that we create, that we bring about. In fact, we can only bring about that when we do the right things now. When we do the wrong things, we go in the wrong direction and it will not come. When we do the right things, it will go in the right direction and it will come. And then you could ask, well, so how do I know which is wrong and which is right? And the utopians, well, I'm going to tell you. Okay, so that's one. The second element, the second point where the utopian borrows from the Christian is the idea of overcoming sin. So what a Christian believe? What sin is? Sin is an imperfection that is self-induced, right, through the original sin in Adam, Genesis, and corrupted human nature. Now, it did not corrupt human nature completely, so it's not like that man is not man, but he's not an animal. But it confused nature. So there is a certain hierarchy in human nature that is mixed up. And this is very similar to, let's say, Plato, right? Plato had the same idea that man, if he wants to live a good life, he has to have a balance of all things. He has to balance his will. He has to fight desires that maybe leave him, guide him in the wrong direction or something like that. So he has to balance his life. He has to order his life. And if the life is unorderly and the desires take over, then man will do bad things, right? So if somebody makes me really angry and I take a knife and I stab him, then that is not thinking reasonable, but that's having my anger control me. You see? So, okay, so the Christian says, well, that comes from original sin. If we did not have original sin, if we didn't have sin, then I would be perfectly aligned with my rationality, and I could always, decide, okay, what to do in the right moment. So the utopian, from also what I said before, also sees a lack in man. He doesn't call it sin, but he sees a lack in man, something evil, something incomplete, something imperfect. And he wants to get rid of it. He wants man to be sinless. He wants man to be perfect. And he puts the perfect man, the ideal man, the man at the end of history, he puts that as the goal. And he says, well, let's try to go to that place. Now, now, and this is where kind of different utopians differ, but so some would say, well, sin or the evil is actually just an illusion, and it's not real, it's just an illusion, we got to free ourselves from the illusion. Others will say, well, the sin is present now because we're imperfect, but once we are perfect, once we've become the perfect man, so like the Übermensch or the socialist man, then that lack will be gone. So what they do is, instead of changing or eradicating the evil, they try to erase the effects of that evil. So for example, they try to get rid of pain, or they try to get rid of suffering, or they try to get rid of the toil of work. Now, I'll come back to that later. So the ideal society from a utopian point of view is that moment when the true man appears. So we are all now kind of false men, we're incomplete, but when the true man appears, the perfect man appears, the actual man appears, then everything will be authentic, it will be, we live in paradise, in utopia. Okay, so then that complete regeneration is overcome. Okay, and you can see obviously again the difference to the Christian. The Christian says, well, man cannot get rid of sin. In fact, there are two types of sin. There's original sin and personal sin. And man cannot get rid of original sin at all, never, in his state of nature now, in his life. But there's also personal sin, and personal sin you can combat. You can form virtues, you can ask God for forgiveness, you can be forgiven the sin, and being forgiven means it's not your own power. Right? If somebody forgives you, like you cannot force, if you steal something from your friend and you apologize, you can apologize, but you cannot force your friend to forgive you. Right? It's on your friend's decision to forgive you. Okay, so that's point number 2. Point number 3 is this idea of the messianic kingdom. And this is what's really interesting, because when you look at the utopia of different shades or forms or even times, this ideal state of the future society or of the end of history is very similar to this coming of the messianic kingdom. Now, for a Christian, the messianic kingdom is something that he already knows what it is. So the second coming of Christ will not redefine, or the last judgment will not redefine revelation. It will bring revelation to its historical end. But we already know, like for a Christian, Christ already told us what will happen. So there's nothing new. For the utopian, that's very different. Everything in this messianic kingdom will be made new. Not just the individual person with his faults and his weaknesses will be completely turned into the Übermensch, but also society will be perfect. So there will be a perfect living together in society. So the interpersonal relationships will be purified from all the evil effects of being as it is now. So the utopian is fascinated with the novum, with the new, with that which is not yet here. Okay, so the utopian then, in this belief, starts with the organization of this new world now, or at least that's what he says he does. Okay, and some of the features of this perfect state are obviously something like a universal love, right? So everybody is really friendly to one another, always, all the time. There's a perfect justice, there's perfect distribution of goods, there's perfect equality, there's perfect equity, whatever it may be. There's even maybe perfect knowledge, right? And perfect science, right? This idea of August Comte, like the scientific progress of society and of science. Okay. Great, so that's basically some of the philosophical elements of utopia and some of the secularized elements of Christian revelation that the utopian secularizes and uses. So let me give you a couple of applications that I found. There are many, so I'm not going to be exhaustive here, but just give me a couple of them. So number 1, the worldview, right, of the utopian is closely connected to the cosmological question, and this is something that is universal. How whatever a society or a group defines as their gods and as the definition of where the gods come from will manifest itself in the life of that society. Because the gods are, at least looking from above, the most important elements of a culture and of living together, right? Okay, and then those gods define reality, they define the cosmos, they define the individual life and the individual person, and therefore also the political order. And I mean, Eric Voegelin points this out, political order is always somehow mirroring the religious faith of the people. And I mean, you can see that in history, right? Different religions bring about different orders of society. Okay, so what are some applications of this? So what are some kind of concrete examples? So there's a book called Utopia for Realists by Rutger Bregman, for example, who is a writer and he's named as an agenda setter for the World Economic Forum, for example. And he is basically like the ideal sort of utopian that I try to describe here. And his utopian vocabulary actually flows into numerous policy documents of the World Economic Forum, specifically when he talks about progress, for example, as the highest ideal. This idea of the fourth industrial revolution, the digitalization of life, the new age of justice or equality, and then everything that belongs to that, like equal pay for everybody at all time in all societies. So the social aspirations are deeply connected to his worldview. And the World Economic Forum itself on its website defines this. It says, quote, "Utopianism is actually a philosophy that encompasses a variety of thought processes and attempts to create a better society. It begins with a seemingly simple but powerful statement that the present is inadequate and that things can be different. She is present in communities, social movements, and political discourses, critiquing society and creatively envisioning a future free from constraint of time. Simply put, it embodies a long-standing human impulse towards self-improvement." End quote. So that would be one example. Another example, since we're talking about the World Economic Forum, would be transhumanism, like the type of transhumanism of Yuval Harari. If you look at Yuval Harari's book, Homo Deus, and he's a historian, obviously, but if you look at Homo Deus, he reinterprets history in a way, so he interprets and reinterprets history in a way that lead to special outcomes in the future. And he says, he says, these outcomes are inevitable. And he goes so far as to say, you know, if you don't think about the future because you're too busy working and feeding your family and feeding your children, then you're not part of this project, but this project will still affect your life and everything that you will think and do. Okay, so here would be another example, this type of transhumanism of Yuval Harari. Another, I think, utopian idea is what's called Ecotopia 2121. You can Google that, which basically applies utopian thinking to climate change and to this idea of a climate-neutral city. And they say, quote, "After years of field research, studio work, library work, footwork, travel, research, debate, theorizing, writing, and artistic exploration, a compendium of 100 illustrated stories have been assembled to discuss how various cities around the world can be transformed into green utopias by the year 2121 AD." End quote. And this obviously is specifically the utopian of the climate variety. Their favorite tool to work with on a political base, on a political spectrum, is the rhetoric of fear. Yeah? And I mean, you have that now. You have people who go to psychologists, it's so documented, because they're like fear that, you know, the climate will collapse and we're all going to die. So it's very personal. This is not just something that some politicians say and people are okay, whatever, this politician says this, another politician says something else. This is something that people take very seriously, personally very seriously. Okay, another example, and maybe we can talk about this more also in the discussion, is these kind of science fiction visions or like kind of techno visions. And I'm thinking of some of the things that Elon Musk does. Now, Elon Musk does a lot of good things, but he also has this idea and he has this aura, right, of the visionary that like thinks of these amazing things. And when you look at the portfolio, though, of what he actually tries, also like with a hyperloop and things like that, or space travel, many of them actually don't work. So it looks nice on a website. There's a very nice kind of animation and like this amazing train that's super fast, but nobody really looks at what that means, like what it means to put that in place, like that you need a straight tunnel that is hermetically sealed, that goes through pre-existing villages, that goes through mountains, that goes, you know, through, and only then can the hyperloop work. And is the hyperloop actually the best way of transporting material? Like if you compare the weight that is possible to be carried in comparison to, let's say, trains, freight trains, or even just trucks, like by comparison, is it actually economically better? And the answer to my knowledge is no. I'm not an economist, but you can make those, you make that research on your own. So I found an article that comments on this, which says, quote, Musk is promising something very different. Musk's vision is about using technology to solve the big problems facing our society. How can we power society without causing global warming? How can we transport people and things without polluting the environment or increasing CO2 emission? And finally, how can we spread human life across multiple planets? It's about the big things, not what you hold in your hand, end quote. Now, this is obviously Musk himself speaking, this is a commentator, but I think it summarizes it very well. So, if you want me to, and these are just a couple of examples. So, most generally speaking, and I'm kind of closing here, the political agenda or the political rhetoric of Utopia works mostly on this idea of kind of equality for all members of society. So total equality, the overcoming of toil, so the overcoming of pain in labor, in work, the pains, other suffering in life, right? So depression, like you take a pill, you're not depressed anymore. I don't know, you just get, you know, you just train yourself to, or we augment you in order to have more joyful experiences, right? Even kind of the use of drugs is in there somehow. And then this kind of globalism, right? Everything is always happening on a global scale. And everything always has to be sustainable. And it's very interesting to look at the different definitions of what people actually mean by sustainable. Okay, so these are just a couple of examples. So I'm closing, and what I hope to have demonstrated is a little bit of the utopian mindset. Not everything, but a little bit, as much as half an hour permits me to do, the philosophical roots, and then also the secularized theological roots of it. And I hope that by doing this, by detecting the utopian mindset, you are braced against it in a certain way, and you are specifically braced against the totalitarian and detrimental elements of it. And what I would propose instead, and I mean, I haven't said anything about like true positive visions, that would require another talk. Maybe, you know, next year you can invite me again, we can do that. Instead of utopia, I think we should really strive for a proper vision of humanity that takes into consideration man as he is, with his faults, but also with his tremendous potential, with his creativity, and with his skill, and with his capacity to overcome obstacles. And if we do that, then I think we'll be properly enabled to envision the future for our society. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for the, well, quite expensive presentation of why we should be able to recognize utopian thinking and recognize if it's dangerous to really delve into that type of thinking. And now I will put some questions, and after that you can also put your own questions to Dr. Bentz. And but we now start the discussion part. So I have a few questions. Well, as utopian thinking, this struggle for a perfect society was always present in human history, and there were many attempts to realize one. What would you say from Plato's Republic to the concept of the Phalanster? Which ideas of utopia are the best examples to prove your point? Because you were talking about utopia, but you were a little bit vague on what utopias, what projects of utopias were done in history.
Yeah, so very good question, thank you. Well, I think, so I gave you a couple of examples of political, current political rhetoric. So now obviously we don't know the end of that yet because it's going on. I think in the past, if you look in the past, so I don't think that utopians are always part of kind of societal thinking. They're always visions for the future, but that's not the same as utopia. And in fact, when you look at Thomas Molnar, who obviously wrote the book Utopia, what does utopia mean? Utopia means no place, right? So it's the place that can never be reached. And there's a good argument, I think, that he wrote that almost as satire, showing that, well, this is a blueprint of what all utopias are like, and wait for it, spoiler alert, they will never happen. I think whenever an ideology tries to redefine man, that's when the utopia is doomed to fail. And so I think, the most kind of prominent examples of that obviously are the kind of national, the socialisms of the 20th century, right? So Nazism, who redefines man, right? The Übermensch, based on completely kind of bogus history, right? The Aryan, what is the Aryan? The Aryan is basically an invention by the Nazis based on some kind of mythical Atlantis. It's literally based on Atlantis that, whose scientific enlightened inhabitants went to India and became the Brahmins, and so the Aryans are the descendants of the Brahmins, of the highest class of India. Okay, that's bogus history. So that's one, and that's a redefinition of the man, right? The perfect human being is the German, Übermensch. And the other is, again, the socialism, is the socialist man. So it's all types of socialism, and specifically communism, that have been tried, very much so, and have very much failed. Not just because they were attacked, but because the system collapses. So it's not because of a foreign invader, but it's because structurally it doesn't work. And so socialist man is, again, this idealist utopian redefinition of human nature that I think is doomed to fail. So whenever the idea is more important than the actual reality of man, I think that's when things go downhill.
Well, as you can see, utopias that were set in motion in history, for example, like we said, socialism, end up in dystopia. And as history and a lot of fiction books warn us about. But there are plenty of ideologies today that try to convince us that to pursue and build utopias. Even, before this talk, I thought about utopias as something positive that inspires people. How did, through history, realist thinking prevail over this monistic utopist one?
Yeah, so again, this is really interesting. The very word dystopia is already taken into consideration that utopia is something positive, whereas I would argue that whenever utopia was used, and again, Thomas Molnar is kind of the first one, but then there are others as well throughout history, that is in itself a dystopia. There is no proper distinction. Every utopia is a dystopia, but obviously fiction and science fiction and novels, they allow to elaborate like a kind of like a post-apocalyptic world, right? Where you see, well, there were good intentions in the beginning and then everything went badly, right? I don't know, like Terminator, right? The good intention of making a really good machine and then the machines take over and destroy all humanity. Or, I mean, Hunger Games, all of these, like especially like teeny novels, there's a lot of that fiction in there. So I would say, which positive visions of the future have worked in the past? That's a hard question. I would say maybe there are three elements that we could look at that are helpful. Number one is have a realistic vision of human nature, including all the good points and including the weaknesses of man. So, for example, there will always be corruption. Like, you cannot have a society without corruption, but that's why you need laws. I mean, that's the whole point of laws, is to keep things in order, even when something happens that is out of the ordinary. Okay. The other is, I think what's very important is this a principle of subsidiarity. So, in the Anglo-Saxon world, they talk about small government. So, whatever can be solved locally should be solved locally and not globally. Why? Like, why? Because when you are in the place, then you know best what the problem is, how it arose, and what the possible solutions are. So, and this is something that is, for example, very much part of the thinking of the Americans, right? Or the North Americans, of the United States. Whatever is to the state does not have to go on a federal level. Because somebody who lives in Washington has no idea what happens in some kind of small podunk town in Missouri, necessarily. But the people who live in Missouri know what's going on in Missouri. So leave it to them to resolve the question. So it's a movement not to global, but it's a movement to the local. And I think that generally has been proven positive. And then the third would be, and this is a little bit more, again, philosophically, sorry, I'm guilty, it's my job, is that we don't over-politicize all elements of our lives. So politics is politics, it's very important, and I mean, I stand very much with Aristotle, who says that man by nature is a political animal, because everything that we do, in a certain way, has societal impact. I mean, even if we just talk about the society of like our family, for example, right? A small society. But I think it is dangerous to make everything about the political, specifically when it comes to religion, right? So whenever there's religion, I think there's a very important distinction that must be made, so that the transcendent values, the transcendent transcendent parts of life, remain transcendent and do not get politicized. Because what happens? The political will take over, and the power that is being seized will not be given back. And I think that's one of the lessons of history. Whenever power is seized, it will very rarely be given back voluntarily. It will actually turn into a tyranny, and then somebody will get shot, and then it will maybe goes back to where it was before. So to say this kind of in a simple way, like if God is the one who gives, right, then man has no right to take it. But if, I don't know, Obama gives, then Obama can take away. And so I find it very important that, for example, fundamental concepts of human life, such like the dignity of human life, is not something political that has to go beyond politics. Because if the value of human life is defined by political power, well, it can be redefined. And if we are there, then we have a big problem. So that's kind of, those would be some practical. I don't really have like an answer to which ideal has worked. You can look at the North American enterprise. I mean, that it's been going well for many centuries. I don't know, some of the European countries have a pretty good idea about it, but so.
Well, your whole presentation started from the ideas of Thomas Molnar or Molnar Tamás. And he states that as heresy correlates to faith, so in a similar way, utopia correlates to politics.
Yeah.
And I presume you agree with this this sentence. Can utopias be a source of inspiration without leading to extreme ideologies? Or it is inherently a bad thing that one should always dismiss?
Yeah, good question. Okay, so this is something that is very important. What is a heresy? And this is something that we need to define. So Molnar comes from a Catholic background, and so a heresy is when you take the whole of faith, so the whole of the deposit of revelation, right, in Scripture, in Christ and the Apostles, and you remove one element and you overemphasize that element, or you remove one element and you deny that element. Okay, so what happens to the depositum of faith? If you do that, then everything, the whole balance between, started raining very heavily, okay. The whole network, the whole fabric of truth is out of balance. Because on this side now there's something missing, and on this side there's a little bit too much. So the scale is not balanced anymore, but it's out of balance. So what do I mean? This is kind of a famous example by Newman. Christians fear God and they love God. But fear and love seem to be contradictory. Because what I love, I don't fear. That it's opposite almost. So I do both. I'm supposed to do both with God as a Christian. I fear God and I love God. Okay. If I remove one of the two, so if I remove fear and it's just love God, then this idea of love will be completely redefined in a sense. Because love then just means like, well, everything has to be accepted. And it becomes like a sentimental idea. Because you don't really, okay, well, if God is just all loving and there's no justice, we're going to have a really hard time explaining like an innocent child dying of cancer. Okay. If I remove love and I just stay with fear, and I just fear God, and I don't have a personal relation with Him, then God becomes someone that is very far away, like a king, right? Like a really powerful king, that I may follow, and he may remain transcendent, but ultimately, more and more, I don't really care about that king. And I'm actually very happy when he leaves me alone. Because whenever he comes, like something gets destroyed and something gets taken away. So I need to keep fear and love together. So what is it? So heresy is that. It's the removal of one thing and leaving just the other. That's at least how I understand Molnar. And that's the thing, that's utopia for politics. Utopia for politics is picking one element and removing all of the others. And there was a very good article that I read way in the beginning of when like Corona happened. And it was saying, well, okay, we are obviously wanting to defend human life, but human life is more than just health. So whenever policies were put in place, they did not, for example, take into consideration psychological damage, which is something that politicians know about. Like, psychological damage is a real thing. So while you save one person, you may lose another. And that's okay, like that's a reality of human life. But that's not how politicians put it. They put it and said, well, we have to save. And it's like, yes, but you're also sacrificing, and you're not talking about this. That's the utopian. The utopian is not upfront. He emphasizes the positive, but he kind of, puts behind the curtain what's negative. So I would say that that's how Molnar reads it. So when that happens to politics, then I invite you to always look at whoever says something and you say, okay, so that's the positive. Okay, so no CO2 emissions or no gas from Russia or whatever in German politics. Like, what does that actually mean? That means you're not going to be able to heat your house in the winter. That our children are going to be in school in coats because it's so cold they can't write because their hands are shivering. So I'm not saying that that's a necessary, that may not be a necessary sacrifice to make. What I'm saying is the politicians are not upfront about the sacrifice, and they just assume that everybody agrees with that. And then obviously you have different politicians doing different ideas. Okay, so that's kind of that impact of heresy and faith and of utopia and politics. So, but I want to give you also a positive. I think the ideal, so the vision for the future, is always something that is obviously creative, is obviously positive, should emphasize, again, human ingenuity, and there's lots of that. New inventions, new entrepreneurial spirits and all of that. But it should always take into consideration how much it can actually change. So I'll give you an example from like kind of transhumanism, and I'm no biologist, but I think this makes sense, is I would say medical solutions to problems, kind of genius solutions to problems are very good. So I don't know, I lose a hand, and so a medical engineer comes up with like a bionic hand, right? So it's a metal hand that I can hopefully use like a normal hand, and it's even maybe connected to the neurons and all of that. I mean, to a certain degree, that already exists. I think that's really great, right? That's a really great thing. But you replaced something with something that ought to be there, because a human being has two hands. So if I lose one hand, something is lacking. So now I need to replace that hand. Okay. When engineers come up with, well, let's modify the eye so that you can see infrared, I would say we should really think about the repercussions of that and take into consideration the positives and the negatives, because this may actually completely destroy the eye, or this may actually not be useful at all, and we would look at the world really differently and not necessarily better. So that's an example that I just kind of thought of. I don't know if it's helpful, but...
Still have one last question, and I will open the possibility to the public. But you in your conclusion, I don't think if you mentioned it, that what you said to me is previously that you think that we should not chase utopias. We should be content with the imperfections and limitations of human nature.
Mm.
That should be a fact, that should be not a fault needed to be fixed, but a accepted thing. And you believe that there is immense potential of humans that through that they can conquer all challenges. In my point of view, I think this way of thinking is no longer the mainstream in modern debates about the future. What do you think? What changed in history that now the utopias are trendy things again? Trendy things to believe in. We get all sorts of utopias now.
Yeah. Well, historically, and I very much agree with Molnar, it's the idea of looking to the future for salvation and not looking to the past. Because when you look to the past, then first of all, you already know what is part of your vision. And you can decide what is good about it and what's bad about it. And that's ideally the job of a historian when he has a job. So we need to get this guy a job, right? So you can look at it and you can say, okay, well, this has worked and this has not worked. Let's stick with the stuff that works. Let's change, modify the things that do not work. So that's kind of the main outset. If you put the solution to the future, nobody knows what the future brings. Nobody looks into the future. Nobody's a prophet. And in fact, this is going to be a little bit radical. there is no future. Future is always now. There is no moment right now. This is the future of 5 minutes ago. Like the future is now that we have come to the right end of our discussion after my talk. That was future, well, 30 or 40 minutes ago. So there is no future. Future never comes. It's always the present that is. And that's real. So obviously I can try to change something, like in my daily habits, for example, right? I don't know, if I weigh too much and I want to lose weight, I say, well, tomorrow I'm not going to have dessert. But right now it's just in my mind, and it's a fairy tale. When will it be real that tomorrow I won't have dessert? When I'm at the end of the meal and I'm not ordering dessert, and I leave the table and I start going back to work. Then then it's real, but it's already past at that point, you see? So I'm not losing weight by thinking about the perfect diet. I'm losing weight by having done a good diet. And so that's the kind of the mystery of human existence. We are always between the past and the future. So I think that the mindset who always looks for solutions in the future can be helpful in order to have a vision, and visions are really, really, really important. But usually visions do not mean redefining reality completely, if that makes sense. I hope it's a very fine line here. I hope it makes sense. But so I would say, whenever we come up with a vision, first it has to be based in reality, right? So you need to know your lifestyle in order to know that you can have no dessert tomorrow. And you know yourself pretty well, probably, at this point. I mean, the older you get, the better you get to know yourself. Or that eating right before bed is really, it's gonna, it makes you feel happy or whatever. So you know yourself. So the vision is always tied to the present. That's number one. And I think, so that's part of a good vision. And the second vision is always be ready for abuse. And I mean, I'm sure that all of you have had that experience. Every policy, every political decision can be abused. Not just used, but abused. And I have to say, know the difference. Okay, so I stop here so I don't monologue too much. And yeah, I mean...
thank you very much. That was all from my part too. Now if somebody has a question, now is the time to show.
Would reaching a utopian state cause stagnation?
Very good. Very, very good question. That's the question, right? Whenever utopians talk about the perfect state, they don't really talk about that state. And I'm not just talking about like state as a political entity, like state as in like the being, a state of being.
Yes, as a being.
Is still in time. And time is like, there's a law of entropy. Like everything that lives slowly also dies. And this is, I mean, what's most extreme for me, as an example historically, is Marx's idea of the perfect state. It's like in Marx's kind of definition of the perfect state, it's a state where nobody ever does anything bad or egotistical. And to me, that just does not seem realistic. So yes, I would strongly agree with that. Yes, this is the illusion. This is one of the illusion parts of Utopia, is that they completely ignore that there will be stagnation. So yeah, very good observation.
Hello.
Hi.
I hope I am on track with my question, because I was also taking photos and I was not able to hear everything you said, but my question is, what is your input about reincarnation?
Elaborate that a little bit.
Like, do you believe that when someone dies, he is going to come on this earth again and live another life?
Well, how does that relate to Utopia in general, or like, why is that important?
It's just a curiosity.
Okay. No, very good, very good. All right. reincarnation is a religious belief, and that's kind of what I'm trying to say, is if you base your life on reincarnation or the belief of reincarnation, then you make a religious choice, which is fine. People do that. I mean, there are people that believe in reincarnation, so people evidently do that. I would have a hard time understanding how somebody that believes in reincarnation would set out to actually change his life for the better. Because ultimately, to me anyways, reincarnation always leads to a sort of fatalism. Meaning that, well, whatever happens doesn't really matter because, well, I'll die and then I'll just come back. Now, obviously, there are certain kind of doctrines of reincarnation where you say, well, you come back based on your life now, so you'll come back as a better person or a better being or as a worse person. It's like, sure, I don't see any evidence for that. So if I see like zero evidence for that, and if I think plausibly say there cannot be evidence for it, if there's not like an immortal soul that remembers different stages of life, not stages of life, but different lives throughout time, it's unconvincing to me. Yeah.
If there are, yes.
Hello, my name is Tibor. First, I have a very short reflection on the idea of politics and utopia. I think that next year Romania will be the center of utopia because we have 4 elections in 1 year. Secondly, at one point when you were speaking about utopia and how does that relate to theology, you used in one sentence paradise and utopia, and I'm wondering, was that just like by mistake, or do you see more in that?
Very good. So, to your reflection, thank you for telling me that. So, hopefully my talk is timely. So that's good for next year and preparation for next year. That was very much intentional because I really do see utopians to be pseudo-religious. So the idea, but think about it this way: what is paradise? What is paradise for a Christian? Paradise is something of the past. It's the Garden Eden. Paradise is the original garden that God had designed for man, for human beings to live in perfect harmony with nature, with themselves, with God. Okay, so that's paradise. So for a Christian, that already happened. That's past. We lost that chance because there's original sin. So we were banished from it. So paradise is not possible anymore for a Christian. But for a Christian, the resurrection and the participation of divine life is more than paradise. Because Adam and Eve were not directly contemplating God in his essence, which that is what a Christian believes. So after heaven, the definition of heaven is, sorry to spoil that for you, is probably not going to be floating on clouds and playing the harp and, talking with your grandmother about having a nice cup of tea. But it's going to be contemplating God, and since he's infinite, we will infinitely do that. That's the eternity of paradise. So the human essence will be happy because it will be contemplating, which already philosophers say is the nature of man, the end of man is contemplation, contemplating this eternal divine essence. Okay, so when Adam fell, was banished from paradise, that was bad. We lost paradise, no more apples from trees. But we are now, through Christ's coming, allowed to have something even better. So that's the transcendent end now. It's a new end of man. Man's end is not to return to paradise. And I feel that utopians, I can very much work now with this allegory, that utopians just want to go back to paradise, but they don't want to go back to paradise, but they say, well, paradise has actually not come yet. We got to go, there's a garden, and we got to plant the trees. And once there are the trees, there will be no God to banish us from it. So, but it's completely imminent to world history. So imminent, that's a complicated word, obviously, but it's this idea that everything good will happen within human history. And then we come to the problem of stagnation, obviously, that everything in history is prone to die. So no, I said that very intentionally because I do think that utopians, to use Vögelin's words, immanentize the eschaton, putting something that is transcendent to our world into our world. Does that answer the question? Okay, good.
It opens up a lot of questions.
Of course it does. Well, again, I'm a philosopher. Very good.
Hello, and thank you for your talk. I have actually two questions. One of which is, you seem to have framed your talk, like you seem to have juxtaposed utopian thinking and religious thinking. So, do you see religion as an alternative to utopia?
Mm-hmm.
All right, and do you see other alternatives, non-religious alternatives to utopias?
Very good question. He's one of my students, so obviously he asks very good questions. This was not planned, by the way. So, very good question. So, I would say, is religion an alternative to utopia? I think religion is natural to man. So I would say, with one of your famous Romanian comparative religion scholars, Mircea Eliade, that religion is something that you find in every civilization. And I mean, you don't necessarily have to talk about a deity, but you talk about life after death. That's kind of the lowest common denominator. But if there's life after death, there's something transcendent. Okay. So I think every people is religious. Once you remove religion, it will not be gone. That's the fault of the communists. Once you remove religion, religion is not gone. It will be replaced by something else that is pseudo-religious, that takes its place as a placeholder, so to speak. So something political, for example, will become religious, or pleasure will become religion. It's called being a hedonist, or whatever. Right? So I don't think that we can get rid of religion at all. And so yes, I would answer the first question in the positive. I do think that religion is an alternative to utopia. The second question is there a non-religious alternative to utopia?
By non-religious, I mean specifically like world religions, or like existing religions, or formal, institutionalized religion.
Okay. I would say, kind of connecting it to the answer of the first, whenever you deny a human being access to the transcendent, he will make something into religion. And I think the most clear example of that in history would be positivism, which is Auguste Comte's idea of the 3 stages of history, the progress of history, the progress of science, and it will become something religious. So what you end up believing in is man deified. And that's what Yuval Harari says. He says the future of man is going to be being a godlike creature similar to the ancient Greek gods. So we will be like Jupiter or Mars or Venus or something. So I would kind of answer it the same way in that sense. So is there a true non-religious alternative to utopias? Well, utopias are pseudo-religious. So no, there's no alternative, because it will just replace one non-religion but former religion with another pseudo-religion, like positivism, which is in fact religious and will become religious.
All right, thank you.
Welcome.
Any other questions?
I have a question. If just a second. So, if we think that societies are faulty, I think we all agree about that. So we don't have neither of the societies without fault.
Yes.
Then we must agree that we need change.
Yes.
And if we need change, so we need the societies to change, that we need a goal.
Mm-hmm.
So I actually need to rephrase Matti's question, because he actually asked this about, do we need utopias to be kind of to show us the goal for this, or actually I can't remember exactly what was Matti's word for this, so are utopias, if we know they are utopias, if we know they aren't real, but we still need them to show us the way to change.
Yes, very good. So yes, I agree society is imperfect. I agree that we need change. And I agree that we need a goal to which to work. So all of those I agree with. What I see utopias, the issue of utopias are sins. And I mean, this kind of presupposes that my talk is right. So if my talk is wrong, then my answer doesn't make any sense. But if I'm right, that, and if Molnar and others are right, that utopias are pseudo-religions or pseudo-religious, at least in some aspects or in all aspects, then who is the authority to proclaim the ideal? And if that authority, so if the person that defines the goal to which we have to work is only the politicians, then I'm afraid that politicians will very willingly lie about the ideal and abuse the ideal for their own personal agendas, rather than actually bringing the ideal about. So they will use a utopian rhetoric, I don't know, to foster their own financial goals or to just stay in power. Or something like that. So politics must be put in check by something. And if it's put in check by something, like a transcendent authority, for example, so a religious authority, for example, or even a cultural authority, or a scientific authority, or a philosophical authority, right? Philosopher King. Okay, anyway. Then the goal can be properly kind of found out. But again, even then, obviously, we're never really saved. The goal obviously can always be abused. So, and I think in those instances, we really have to be very pragmatic and realistic about what the goal can be. If a politician starts saying our country will have 0 CO2 emissions, I don't need a religious authority for that. I have to go to science. Scientists say this is impossible, and scientists are saying that. So, and if Elon Musk wants travel without CO2 emissions, when you walk, you have CO2 emissions. So what, like this, you know, like so, it's a wrong kind of it's a mixing of fiction and reality, and so I would be very wary of that. So I think many utopias you actually don't need religion at all, you need. And I see you have a question about this. Let me finish this. You need science, you need biology, you need kind of social scientists or philosophers to tell you like what you're trying to do will not work. So, and then maybe there are some religious elements where you need religious authorities. But
so basically, you are saying that utopias are bad because politicians are misusing that. But can they be inspiration? I guess this was the word Matti was using. Inspiration if we know that they cannot be real. It's like the fairy tale. We need fairy tales only if we know that fairy tales are not true. So we need them to show us some kind of a nice goal to go to, but we have to be aware that they are not real.
Yes, but fairy tales have one flaw, which is different interpretations. So what will keep the people being inspired from like radicalization, from gluing themselves to the street to block traffic of ambulances that people die in? That's my problem. See? So if I agree with the inspirational nature, and again, that's where the dystopia, even in fiction, helps to modify, or like something like Brave New World in 1984, where you see the effects, what it actually has. But I find utopias extremely dangerous because of that, because you throw an idea out at a mass of people and you kind of see what sticks. But there's better ways to make politics, and I think we don't have to go so far back in history to look at. I mean, look at the original idea of Europe, for example. That was maybe one time seen as utopian, right? The Adenauer idea, or even the Coudenhove-Kalergi idea, the Pan-Europa Union. That was seen as completely impossible. Like, it was seen as something that is ludicrous. But it happened, actually. There's a European Union, right? So there's a certain unity anyways. And then you have different layers of that. So that was an inspiration, but it was very clearly laid out why we need that inspiration. And Kalergi, Coudenhove-Kalergi, for example, so the first pan-Europa thinker, he said, we need this to not be taken over by Russia and to be an economic force against the United States. That's not utopian, that's not redefining human nature. That's very clear, like, these are the two goals. And then he has some smaller goals, like, okay, it would also be nice if Germans actually talk to French people and just hate on each other. Okay, so that's good. But that's very clear goals. So a politician doesn't have to make up, like, this ideal world of, like, where everybody is brother. No, it's like, we cannot be invaded by these guys, and we have to be an economic trading power with these guys. And I think that's very realistic way of thinking. So that's an example of the recent past to be inspired. Does that make sense? Yes?
Yeah, okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
Well, thank you very much for the questions. We have 3 minutes. If you can formulate your question in 3 minutes, I will allow it.
He's a patient God.
So I think there's a famous saying that in the 21st century everything has already been written. And will we reach that state where all the utopias have already failed? And if the utopias are inspiration, that those all failed utopias, will they mean that we reach the perfect stage of stagnation that is in fact the utopia?
So that's a very broad question. I'll give a very narrow answer. Yes, I think all utopias have already failed. And I think new utopias are not new, but they're just a reformed old utopia. Why do I say that? Because, and I'm sorry, but that's the limit of human imagination. The best thing that man can come up with is always going to be like an idea of the divine. But how do we come up with an idea of the divine? By taking human qualities and exaggerating them, or blasting them out of proportion. So sometimes I'm a really nice guy, so God must be like an extremely nice guy all the time. I'm still starting from my human imagination, what it means to be nice. And so I think all of utopias, and so even if you go to transhumanism, and so let's use Harari, that's the one that I know best. So he has very clear, he says it's either going to be techno-humanism or dataism, so it's going to be a religious veneration of information, or it's going to be like a biochemical transformation of the body. that's what he says. So it's like, okay, so the best thing that he can come up with is, I hope that was me. The best thing that he can come up with is a liberation from the body. So body is a prison. That's Plato. That's not very inventive. We've had that multiple times already in the history. So, no, I think all utopias have already been failed.
Thank you very much for the talk. Thank you very much for the good questions. This was a very attentive public. And so we run out of time. This is the end of today's Transylvania lecture. Well, thank you very much, Jan Bentz, for being here. And you are welcome to next Transylvania lecture. See you soon.
Very good. Thank you.